Dear Corinne, dear founding fathers, or let's say fathers of the Church of Convoco who are present here, and dear newcomers, that would be the exegetes of the New Testament. We can all identify with this image. We have, in a certain respect, also assumed a responsibility to be addressed as founders. But this, of course, is a greatly challenging task, because what are you founding when you try to make your contribution to the unfolding of contemporary thought accessible? Basically, this is about confidence. Confidence in a change of perspective. You could also say this is about the confidence that someone gains that you would listen in order to make a change of perspective possible and to enable someone to reckon with it and experience it. Perhaps in the meantime, it's become a fact that our multi-perspectivity has become part of the program. But if you look at where this program is supposed to be implemented, that is, for example, in the multiculturalism, then, of course, the confidence dwindles in this kind of careless announcement of diversity, because multiculturalism can be identified very easily as a soap bubble. I assume your phone is now occupied by a high authority. Of course, we don't ask for forgiveness, but rather for understanding when talking to high authorities. Well, if something is a culture, then it has to be able to oblige those who are part of the society autonomously to material reproduction, to an independent legislation or foreign relations, as, for example, the ability to declare war and such things. This, of course, in multiculturalism in a large city is not possible. So in this common principle of multiculturalism as an assuming of many different perspectives can only be seen as a folklorism. And of course, science today is also in major part a folkloristic kind of exercise, especially if the majority of university departments believe that the mere presence of members of different cultures are already enough in order to fulfill their duties. What really is worrying is that the sciences themselves seem to be turned back into something like a cultural exercise. This means the 600 years of freedom in arts and sciences that were characteristic for Europe and that are unique in history between 1435 and 1960s or 1989. And this was so convincing to the world that it's been adopted all over the world, in terms of technology, medicine, and in large parts also the principles of the rule of law and democracy, but especially the institutions of the arts and sciences themselves, that in 5.3 of the Basic Law are guaranteed in a unique fashion the situation and the position they had in world history, but only for 600 years. Now the end of arts and sciences seems to have come because apparently scientists themselves now voluntarily bend to the pressure of political correctness and are now willing to look at religious, cultural and ethnic aspects when it comes to scientific decisions. This may be rooted in the fact that the application for funding is being decided upon by people who have a culturalistic background and who now try to carry on the clash of cultures on the level of arts and sciences. Well, in the field that I am at home in, that is the educating sciences and the fine arts, in Latin ut petura poiesis, that means that the insight that the description of a problem is already part of the cognitive working process. Since 1435, this was the maxim under which we were working. Also, the techniques for experiments and for descriptions are already part of the cognitive process. Ut petura poiesis, 1435, it was announced. And this was wrongly only seen as an improvement of the status of craftsmen. No, because of their cooperative representation, they had such a high reputation that they did not need an improvement of their status. So when it's being said that the experts, the handcraftsmen, The empiricists wanted to be elevated to the status of the fine arts, and that is why they claimed that their actions, Pettura, describing like an anatomy, would already be part of the process of insight. The insight of the necessary decoupling of cultural, religious, ethnic, and other obligations in the cooperation of people. The huge and really unique position in history was the question of how can a binding quality be brought about by the work of people. Back then, they were called artists and scientists for the first time in history. There is no term for the artists in Latin, in Greek, in Hittitic, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia. You can't find a description for these jobs. They are incredibly technique, but there were no artists. Proto-scientists, it's being called for the Greek, but that is already an exaggeration. So this was the precondition under which, for the first time, people actually found out what scientific and artistic work is all about, and that is the full decoupling of all kinds of legitimation requirements through the courts, the Pope, the Bishop, to the liege or the princes, the father, the leader of rural communities, the mayor or the condottiere in larger cities that were at the head of the regime. So a full decoupling, with the result that today artists and scientists since 1400s have the claim to say that behind us there is no explanation. Our statements are not being put on the statements of the market, the courts, theology, or the Pope or the Bishop, or whatever. There is no one behind us. The question is, why do we listen? Until then, humanity was used to listening when they could be afraid. For example, vis-à-vis the declarations of a prince that you would be punished if you go away and that you would get a reward if you stay as a claqueur. Now it was being said, okay, why do people listen if behind this statement of this new class of artists and scientists there is no one and nothing, but they explain it themselves? The statements that they made with a view to the 6 different strategies of legitimation, that is, customs, tradition, the father, the Pope, and so forth, they were sensationally directed at making their statements themselves so interesting that you would listen even if you could not hope to be rewarded for your listening or to be paid as a claqueur or to escape some form of punishment for trying to get away. And this means that it is really about what is meant in Pettura, the way that something is being described or displayed, as it is being legitimized in its statement. And artistic and scientific work legitimizes these statements and the authority in a different fashion, and that is by the authority of authorship. With the creation of these 2 new statement generators, the arts and the sciences, the only accepted fashion and authority was created. Authority by authorship. This, of course, was a very apt formulation because auctoritas in Latin means both, and for those who speak dark Latin, it was quite self-evident that they could actually assert their position with that. But, under the maxim of Pettura that describing is already part of the process of insight, and thus they would be poiesis, part of the insight process, well, this was, at the beginning a challenge. And by exaggerating this principle, authority by authorship, it was put in danger. It was called artistic folly or provocative behavior, an increased challenge to actually assert such a statement. And this was unheard of so far because it was far too risky to do something like that. Now it appeared to be possible, but in Latin, there were the invectives between Erasmus and Luther. They had forgotten that it was called evocation, not provocation. This procedure was not undone, but now we know that, a challenge is all about evocation, not provocation, in the sense of the entertaining form of scandalizing. The biggest success in sciences and in the history of the arts were achieved at that moment when people even renounced making themselves an expert for the solution of problems that were created outside of arts and sciences. And that is by not calling themselves experts for the problem solution for the courts and for the erection of, what is all holy, because it was not the temple, it was the city wall that was the center of the stabilitas and the internal logic of such a culturalistic system, for example, the community for defense. And when people then said that they would not want to be those who resolve the problems and that they would not be paid for solving those problems, but, people found out that with every strategy for problem solution that was proposed, new problems were caused, okay? So we would be imposters. And, the problem solution, and that is true until the 20th century, problem solutions could only be defined if the follow-up problems of a problem solution were declared to be smaller than the original problem, and that was called pragmatic sanction. That means if the follow-up problems were smaller, then, pragmatically speaking, it was recognized as a problem solution. And this was then revised in the 20th century because people then finally knew something about the interactions of these smaller follow-up problems. And at the cusp of the public debate in 1991, even every citizen of the Federal Republic of Germany, even if they were not artists and scientists, as the majority, were obliged to recognize exactly that. Because this was the only political contribution of the FDP party in Germany, in 1991, they actually enshrined in law that every single person needs to recognize that medical drugs can be noxious. Ask your physicist or your physician rather, and your pharmacist about the side effects. Means that you have to recognize that by taking a pill against cardiac insufficiency, you do not resolve the problem, but that there are follow-up problems like, renal dysfunctions or liver dysfunctions, and this needs to be taken into account. So there are no medical drugs for cardiac insufficiency that do not have risks and side effects. And that means from 91 onwards, the pragmatic sanction has been removed. The side effects have to be taken into calculation, and if the interactions are not being seen, then the follow-up problems are always larger than the original problem, always. The best-known example for that in modernity was trying to resolve the problem of energy scarcity by using nuclear power. And ever since it's become clear that over a certain amount of time, and that was when irresponsible scientists, as for example at the Center for Nuclear Research or in Jülich, just filled the waste into barrels and dumped these into holes underground like children would dump their toys that they no longer use. And now society has to spend some 48 billion in order to remove that craziness of irresponsible scientists, and that is the recovery of these carelessly dumped waste materials and to neutralize these. And ever since, it's been impossible to speak of problem solutions without pointing out that every problem in world history, without an exception, can only be seen as a problem if you accept that the problem solution leads to creating follow-up problems. Firstly, and secondly, that's being recognized that problems and their solution need to be seen as a unity, and that a certain kind of determination of problems depend on these strategies and the problem solutions. That means that the problem, in its importance, is only becoming visible if the follow-up problems, in hindsight, helped determine the dimension of the original problem. And that is really an immense step forward in scientific working. The self-delusion, or the self-elevation, one could call it, of scientific working as the work of the experts that would help others to resolve their problems, those others who pay scientists, needed to be taken back. And there was another kind of legitimation for scientific working, and that was the miracle that the success of scientific work in generating knowledge consists of, increasing the knowledge about what we do not know. That means the success of generating knowledge is to increasingly know what we do not know. Especially with the view to strategies of problem resolution, this is of fundamental importance. Because if a problem is a problem, in the sense of we do not know how to resolve that problem, how to behave vis-à-vis that problem, not to speak of the solution, then this question for the justifiability of knowledge as non-knowledge is decisive. That means if you tackle a problem, you can only do that with a view to what you do not know. So research is the ability to gain insight and thus increasingly know what you do not know. But this is a constituting factor for the definition of a problem, because the problem arises out of what we do not know, and with that cannot really deal with, or that we cannot develop our attitude towards to. So our attitude, or the way we deal with, in English in the 1840s it was called management. Unfortunately, it was then used and embraced by politics, but it was called managing. That means that the generation of the Second Industrial Revolution actually started out knowing that there are no problems that can be resolved, and that was at the cusp of believing in progress, that these problems need to be managed. And management means to be able to deal with these problems without having the illusion of the resolution. In Manchester, that was quite normal. Every entrepreneur knew that increasing wages or providing housing for workers, you could not resolve the problem of class differences, and that was the terminology back then. So, management was the strategy that even were part of the ideas of Marx and Engels. The two, and now let's rather say the spectrum from Marx to Luhmann, so they also give us the examples within which this becomes evident, or plausible rather, because evidence is critical. Evidence can only be created by a critique of evidence that itself becomes evident. It's clear. You can't trust your eyes as a scientist. You know that you can be deceived. So critique of the evidence, and this critique needs to become evident again. You need to have gadgets or numbers that you can display in order to realize the critique of evidence as evidence. So plausibility is better. With a view to the question of what really convinces us when it comes to the statement, of saying, okay, I understand something. This or that can be accepted as justified. I can't think of any more than what I hear, so I accept it. And that is the basic orientation that was created back then. That is the ability to accept that no faith healing or theological finesse could actually make us believe, or fantasies of omnipotence of rulers could, there were the examples of Titus in Jerusalem and other perpetrators, so no omnipotence on the historical level could actually create plausibility, because the success of power actually is based on the fear of its instability, triggers this fear. That was the general historical experience. The bigger the challenge, in the sense of the absolute implementation of solution strategies, that is by acquiring power, for example, the riskier the whole undertaking. Totalitarian regimes, even of the modern type of the 20th century, the three best-known examples we all know, failed because of their success. Failure by success is the maxim for judging these phenomena in modernity. And this led to the work of scientists and artists to try to renounce competences for problem solution, unless, of course, it was about trying to acquire funds. So no one would be talking about that if they knew what it was all about. They knew that the increase of not knowing is the result of scientific work and that the process of research can never be ended. And this is, of course, a huge challenge that goes beyond ideologies. You know, the competition of artists and scientists means that they cannot just, be quiet with a view to this phenomenon by declaring that they had formulated some kind of work as an interim stock taking. But for the work, we have to say that if you deduct from the work itself, the work needs to be able to survive, for example, in a museum, no matter what kind of museum. With a view to those examples of the past, and Luhmann then subsumed them under the heading of problems only being significant when they are not solvable. And problem means the principle of unsolvability. The imposition of reality consists of accepting that there is a sphere that we cannot influence with our will. We do not have the power to actually influence these things with our will. And this gives us an insight into the dimension of the work when it comes to the unsolvability of problems. And this, in the end, also legitimizes what, after Marx and Engels, was then developed as the theory of democracy. Because if it is part of democracy that everyone should be equal with a view to the controlling mechanisms of society, then of course they can't be equal in terms of their genetic disposition or their social position or their upbringing, but they are rather only equal in one respect. From the street sweeper to the professor, that was the historical expression used. If you take into account what their real achievements are, and that is to recognize what they do not know, what they cannot do, and what they do not have. That means the equality of all people can only be created through the insight generated by education that we're only equal with a view to the fact, no matter what we work, street sweeper or professor, that we experience through knowledge that we do not know, that we cannot do, and which we cannot have. And this is the basic principle of equality in democracy. The examples for this kind of attitude are very simple. The generation of Feuerbach scholars, that is the first generation of Hegel scholars, actually referred to examples that we still use today, as, for example, the orientation towards the practical side of things, the practice of weather spells, for example. It's known from all cultures that in the early times, prehistorically speaking, they did weather spells. They tried to influence the gods of weather or the forces that create the weather and to appease them and to get them to behave accordingly to our own will by offering sacrifices or prayers, offer some form of compensation to pacify them. And this weather spell was carried on even into the 20th century because the decision of the Supreme Soviet to influence the weather around Moscow and to make it part of the will of the party to have bright weather during the festival for the celebration of the revolution by milking the clouds that were approaching Moscow. This, of course, was nonsense. And this kind of weather spell, cloaked as science, is by no means different when compared to the spells uttered 7,000 years ago in some cave in southern France or wherever in the world. Because for logical reasons, it's, of course, impossible, just as it is impossible to claim today that you only need some 280 billion additional dollars as investment and another 20,000 scientists, and you would have resolved the problem of cancer. Seriously, grown-ups wrote that into the application for their research. I experienced that 3 years ago, and they actually were then granted the status of an excellence center on top. So we do not have to try to look down on this kind of magical belief of our forebears. I mean, these are the historically simplest examples that the Feuerbach generation dealt with. Science as a magic spell. This was then elaborated and in many cases it was of course superior to individual examples of this historical example, but as a whole it was just magic, and that was how it was perceived publicly. The average statement about the achievement of science was that the work of science actually functions like magic, and that it cannot be understood in any justifiable way how these fabulous results were brought about, how they were being justified, and so on. So the motive of magic is very close to the motive of general deception. That is, of the tricks of the magicians, and the cusp of this kind of explanation of science as magic or religious spells, whether spell kind of thing, was then that the acrobats in the circuses of this kind of magic, in front of rolling cameras, were showing their demonstrations, so that there was a real first decisive cognitive difference. The rest was just a sociological claim, but this cognitive dissonance was created when, in front of the eyes of people, quite evidently, this kind of magic thing happened, and the participants were aware that this kind of magic could not exist, because this kind of justification was excluded, as a principle. And as children, we were familiar with that, and at school we had learned that parallels only meet at an indefinite point, and then we were standing on the railway platform seeing that the rails met in front of the horizon, and this is where that was created what we see as a motivation to dealing with the unsolvability of problems. The cognitive dissonance between what you know and that what you evidently see as proof or evidence of the justifiability. The second prominent example in this respect, before 91, and before the public was then forced to accept it by law, was of course the way that the highest ranking representatives of science, mathematicians and physicists, particle physicists and astrophysicists from the 50th onwards, acted as representatives of science itself, and they could assert their position with the utmost success. Now, these scientists were then, for example, given the task of removing nuclear waste as a part of their problem solution strategies. That is, to have an endless source of cheap and regenerative energy, as for example in the two opposing procedures that were then mentioned, and the claim that the procedures that were being used, because of the results they achieved, could not be put into question. And that means if in the experiments A and B there was radioactive waste, then this should not be seen as an indication that the formulated problem solution would only be possible because the real problem would be postponed into the far future. That one day we would be able to reshape nuclides, and if not, then we can shoot these off with rockets into space, and we'd get rid of the problem, or we would just bury the whole thing in the earth, And I was a member of a commission in the US since '87, dealing with the question of how we can explain to people in 2,000, 20,000, 40,000 years that this territory or these containers contain strongly radioactive nuclear waste. What form of communication will there still be? And we really thought through everything that is conceivable, following the example of the first plate that was installed for informing extraterrestrial intelligent life as to who we are, where we're from, what the system is that we live in, and so forth. And this all led to no conclusion. The commission was then unbanded in 2003 because it is impossible to resolve that problem in principle, thank God. But the statement that the problem is not solvable in the public did not create an outcry, because scientists knew that they only get their funding if they can make people believe that they can solve problems and not just postpone it into the future and make it a burden for future generations. They say, okay, we first today have resolved the problem, and what happens in the future doesn't matter to us. Then there was 91, and the only ones who had not understood what this act actually meant were the scientists, and you could empirically prove that. Every single patient needed to understand that you have to ask your physician or your pharmacist for side effects. That means the drug that is supposed to resolve the problem of cardiac insufficiency, on the other hand, would have a detrimental effect on your kidneys, for example. But scientists did not notice that, and they did not want to accept that it was true for them too, and therefore their approach for scientific problem resolution. Ask who? The next generation? You can't ask them yet, and eternity cannot be asked, so there was no addressee who you could ask. Physician, pharmacist, that is clear, but with a view to the results of scientific work, there is no one to ask. At this point in time, as we are not here and just talking in private, although this always leads me to formulate things in a more pointed fashion, at this point I would like to ask our colleague Mr. Bani to describe his view on this theorem of the unsolvability of problems. We are a group of professors, an association in the sense of the founding of academies, as for example Newton put it. In the 16th or 17th century, if you wanted to publish your results in writing, you had the problem that there were so many illiterates. It would have been a coincidence to have found someone who knows how to read. So as a writing person, you needed to make sure that someone reads your material, and the consequence was to become a reader as a writer. And to associate yourself in an academy means that you make sure that what you're doing makes sense. If you write, you are a member of the academy, and with the academy you know who would read what you wrote yourself. And that was based on mutuality, so that research, music, writing made sense because you could make sure that, on the other hand, you had the right people to read your material, and you yourself were a reader. And as you today know, is that every writer has at least a single reader, that is yourself, the rest is coincidence. Nature and Science, over the last year, announced for 3 times that they did not have readers any longer, with articles 12 to 18 pages long. I mean, that's nothing. I read that in an hour, No one reads that anymore. Copyright lawyers who are specialized on exploiting these possible copyright infringements read that, but no colleagues read that. The question is, why do people not read what their competitors write? Well, they don't officially, because, if they read it, they could be addressed with a view to plagiarism, but not having read them, they can't be reproached with anything. It's that simple, and it's the same everywhere. And if Nature and Science say that 3 times in a single year, then you need to take it seriously. For us scholars of the humanities and artists, you can say, okay, that doesn't matter, you don't count. But of course, everyone is also responsible for the design of their outfit, and they always try to rely on aesthetics, although it doesn't have anything to do with aesthetics. So no, I did not mean you. No, you were just, sitting so close. Mr. Palmi, is outstanding because he made a systematic summary of the European history of epistemology, and please take a look at that. And I can also give you other urgent recommendations with a view to what our other members wrote. I had just had a work of Birgit here. Where is it? Seems to be lost. Okay, you already took it. Walter Dage from Celle, he is a professor for particle physics in Hanover, and he worked also on the subject of unsolvable problems, and he looked at the proposals for a permanent dumping ground for nuclear waste. I think this is an idea that is delusional. From 86 onwards it was discussed, and now it seems to be generally accepted. You know, if you recognize the problem that we cannot resolve the problem of nuclear waste, but that we rather have to find an adequate way to manage this unsolvable problem, then it means that the nuclear waste should be stored above ground, visible for everyone, and the responsibility that is part of the evidence needs to be taken into account. So, above ground nuclear waste grounds. And the direct responsibility that is underlined by the evidence needs to be taken into account. Above ground nuclear waste dumping grounds. And that is very interesting. This also points to a function of science to today's society, although this does not seem to be relevant in the first place. If you say that there is a kind of accountability in the relationships of people, that is the defining feature of cultures, then this is normally being brought about by religions. The Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever. But what kind of reliabilities were actually brought about by cultures? Okay, let's be generous. 3,000 years of Judaism and 3,000 years of pre-Buddhist attitudes, and all of this together. Egypt, 3,000 years, let's say 5,000 years. But what are 5,000 years of accountability? Although these are unique exceptions compared to 40,000 years of half-life time that really make a great responsibility necessary. And if we store this nuclear waste above ground, this means a kind of compulsory service, as we had a compulsory military service for eternity. That is a kind of cultic ritualistic service for this eternal danger that also creates accountability, a danger that can only be managed but that cannot be done away with through visions or by trying to just bury it underground in the desert or wherever. Mr. Bami, the floor is yours. Bazon Brock said that I would have 15 minutes. Yesterday it was 15 minutes at least. I would like to paraphrase his concept of the unsolvability of problems from my perspective. There are concepts that actually characterize certain eras. Just think of the term the risk society that was coined by the Munich sociologist Ulrich Beck in the 80s when the things in Chernobyl happened. Or if you think of the concept of postmodernity of the French social philosopher François Lyotard, who said, okay, the time of the great narratives is over. It doesn't really matter whether today you're a Muslim or a Christian. It doesn't really play a role for the further development of the world. Or whether you like Heidegger or Adorno. This time when people disputed that is over. What's of central importance today is technology and the economy. Or if you think of an entirely new concept, that is the concept of Anthropocene, that was coined by Paul Crutzen, carrier of the Nobel laureate for chemistry, who pointed out how actually dangerous the hole in the ozone layer is. And he said the time of the Holocene is over. That was the era that was defined until today, and ever since the 18th century we are living in a time of the human being, the Anthropocene, and the man itself has become a geological factor, as a rule with very bad effects for the environment. All these are terms and concepts that very nicely define eras, stretches of time, and the concept of the unsolvability of problems is such a concept coined by Bazon, as you all know, and this is what we are talking about. With this concept, he actually opened up a new research program. This term has been around for a number of years, and what's interesting about these concepts as the risk society or unsolvable problems is that they refer to phenomena that are linked to each other. You could, for example, say that the era of human beings, the Anthropocene, is the era that, because of wrong narratives, produces unsolvable problems that entail enormous risks. Bazon is a tightrope walker between the areas of the arts and the sciences. This allows him to be creative and original, and it also opens up the possibility to formulate criticism in a very radical fashion, and of course every expert scientist is envious of that. You know, if I have to use these arguments among my colleagues, I'd have difficulties. But if you work in the field between arts and sciences, you have these possibilities that allow you to speak some forms of truth that are either not being discussed in the field of sciences or are rather heavily disputed. So his theory in principle is that unsolvable problems are characterized by the fact that they are unsolvable, and we have to somehow learn how to deal with them. And we would have to learn how to deal with that, you know, not to just follow the wish of trying to resolve this, but somehow try to learn how to effectively manage that. And I would say, or no, let's put it differently. My approach is the following. I make a difference between two social approaches. We've got the modern, dynamic society of modernity, and then there were the traditional, archaic, pre-modern societies. And modernity, or modern society, is characterized by the fact that its dynamism, if we put it euphemistically, its progress, is based on the fact that they try to work through unsolvable problems. So they can't be resolved, but they constantly work on these problems. I would like to give you two examples for this. In the 60s, we became aware of the fact that coal-powered power plants actually are a burden for the environment. We produce CO2 and so forth. Something needed to happen. And the first solution were nuclear power plants. And nuclear power plants, of course, in that respect are cleaner, but as Bazon already pointed out, there were at least two follow-up problems that had not been taken into account. On the one hand, you produce heavily noxious waste that cannot be dealt with for thousands and thousands of years. And on the other hand, this technology is also burdened with high risks, and this risk is not very likely to become a reality, but if it becomes a reality, we are faced with disaster. We've learned to understand that too, and now again we try to resolve that problem, but basically we're always talking about postponing the problems, and now we're trying to use wind energy, solar technologies, and this, at first glance, seems to be a nice solution. But now I've been told by physicists that things are not that simple, because they need to be built, all these installations and machines. You need material, you've got transport costs. And, of course, the mediation of energy goes through electricity, and you need copper for that. And copper is limited as a resource, and you can do the math when copper resources will be used up. So another example of how we try to solve a problem by actually just postponing the actual problem. A second example I would like to give you. We are driving our cars using fossil fuels, and we know that this is just not sustainable. We need to resolve that situation, and now people think of using renewable energy sources. So now people grow corn in order to produce biofuels. But now I just read that the Lufthansa is planning to retrofit its whole fleet to use biofuel. And you would need to have a cornfield of the size of Lower Saxony. And you couldn't do that in Germany, of course, so it would be planted in South America or South Africa. And this cornfield of the size of Lower Saxony would then push aside the food industry. And this is happening today. If you've got a clean conscience because you are using E10 fuel, I think it's called in Germany, but at the same time you're making sure that in the third world some child is dying of hunger because instead of a handful of rice, you created some droplets of biofuel. These are just a couple of examples for this theorem of Bazon of unsolvable problems. We currently have these success experiences, but a couple of years later we see that we did not resolve a problem, but rather postponed the problem into the future. As opposed to these modern dynamic societies, static and pre-modern or archaic societies did not have this kind of problem. They were one with their environment, and if a population of nomads, for example, had had their animals graze on a certain piece of land, then they would just move on and the pasture could grow back. But whenever they were faced with disasters, they were natural disasters as opposed to today. And that is why today we're talking about environmental disasters, because these disasters, as a rule, are all generated by man. So the question of Bazon is, how do we deal with unsolvable problems? I'm a sociologist, and that is why I paraphrased this for myself and put a point on it, analytically, socially, historically. I would like to follow up with the question of what do we do when the accumulation of unsolvable problems leads to the collapse of a society. And I would like to again give you two examples. The Easter Islands may be familiar to you. They have these nice statues there. You can travel there with Europa 2 currently, and that was a very happy culture up until the 18th century. They had a kind of economic cycle going that was sustainable, and then something happened that we can hardly explain to ourselves. They started erecting these statues. There were 11 clans, families on that island, and they had an high priest, a chief individually, and they started competing as to which high priest would have the largest statue. And this then led to the fact that an island that was covered in forests was then deforested. They just cut down the trees in order to be able to transport these figures to the beaches. And the figures themselves became so tall that they could not even transport them any longer. They just remained in the quarries, and the result was an environmental disaster. And they could not get off the island, as it is positioned right in the Pacific Ocean. And, they then became aware of that, and they dethroned the chieftains. But it was too late, and everything ended very tragically in cannibalism. They started eating each other. That was the Easter Islands in the 18th century, approximately. At about the same time, a similar problem in France arose, 1789. The political elite, the Bourbons, squeezing out the country in order to live in luxury while the population is starving. They are clamoring for bread, and the queen is being told that people ask for bread, and she said, okay, why don't they eat brioche, cake? And what's interesting is that she did not mean this ironically. She was serious because she could not imagine what hunger felt like. So we can see that the political elite was not aware of the everyday life of the majority of society. And that means the systemic imperatives of monarchy were something that they could not get out of. They created problems that they could not resolve in the environment of that system. And then, of course, the problems were resolved by the revolution, and the largest imaginable crime was then committed. The king was decapitated, and the republic was proclaimed. So the systemic imperatives were changed. The monarchy was done away with, and the republic was proclaimed, and the problems, of course, persisted. The republic also was pushing around the problems. And what I'm trying to get at is that this happened on a historically higher level, the Easter Islands, France, and the question was, what do we do when the accumulation of unsolvable problems reaches a point that leads to the collapse of society. We don't yet have any answers. I mean, this is what he's been saying for a number of years. But we can at least name some factors why, structurally speaking, we cannot resolve certain problems. One basic problem is science, as it is being done today. Science means abstraction, isolation, so we try to abstract from certain parameters, isolate some variables that we think are important, create a model, and according to that model change reality. But now there are some factors that we excluded from our examinations beforehand, and it's these factors that then lead to follow-up effects that we had not taken into account. So that is because we use scientific methods, we create a plethora of follow-up problems that we had not reckoned with. Second example, politics. Every sociologist knows that we are marching towards a global society. And the problem that we are faced with is that we don't have a way of managing this global society. A very interesting paper was published at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, the title of which was Governing the World Without a World Government, ? So we are still living in national states, politics, things along the lines of national boundaries, but the problems that we are constantly creating are of a global nature and cannot be resolved by nation states. And there is another additional second factor, that everyday politics is very short-sighted. Politicians think of cycles of 4 years, they want to be re-elected, and a problem that only becomes salient in 50 years' time and is a problem of our children or grandchildren is something that cannot be covered in everyday politics, and that is why it's being ignored. If you recall, Madame Merkel originally wanted to expand the operating times of nuclear power plants, and then Fukushima happened, then Stuttgart 21 happened, the CDU lost a lot of its support, and then they said, okay, no, we will not expand the operation times. But not because of new scientific insights or whatever, but for, election reasons. There were no insights, and this had been known before already. So this is a structural deficit as to how politics is being done today against the backdrop of long-term effects that we are constantly producing. And the same holds true for the economy, if you will. The economy is oriented towards national economies and are very short-sighted. Capital needs to pay off relatively quickly, and social costs are not part of the calculations. If you look at what's happening in the Steiermark, open-pit mining, this is something that the state has to pay for re-establishing some form of nature in that area. But originally this would have to have been a part of the price calculation of the products that were produced then. But it was not done then, and it's not being done today. So we don't really have any answers. I would like to subsume that. Mr. Brock gave me 15 minutes. So the question of Bazon Brock, how to deal with unsolvable problems in a meaningful way, and my sociological question, my follow-up question is, what do we do if the accumulation of unsolvable problems lead to a collapse of society? And this, of course, does not happen overnight. It's a long process. There will be civil war-like conditions, and society will somehow fall apart. The question now is how to deal with that. I would like to thank you for your attention. And quite quickly, if you look at what at the 16th century happened, there was a man called Perudino. He had a pupil called Raphael, who was very influencing for another genius, Michelangelo, who, again, was then an influence to Caravaggio at the end of the 16th century. And Caravaggio used him as a legitimation of his behavior. And they can do without thinking about progress in the sense of improving our ability to resolve problems. No, on the contrary, in the history of art that's only been around since 1819, or with Winkelbank and the archaeological preforms 1750, biographies of artists since the middle of the 16th century, then this means that there is a kind of understanding of the importance of the individual artists that consists of creating problems instead of resolving problems. That means the Palade IV painter creates problems that not even the gifted Raphael thinks he could resolve, and he again creates problems that not even Michelangelo, as a gifted person, would think of being able to resolve. And then he'd say, this is what makes him so grand, the individual artist, that we cannot replace them by imagining that the pupils would be better than their masters, or that the next generation would be better, or that there would be a progress in the unfolding of painting that is so enormous that everything else looks like a primitive first effort, as for example in the development of aviation. Even the most primitive within this set of conditions until 1900, like the Romanesque era, was indeed a high point for the development of this history. You can see here in our exhibition an example as to how the artists deal with it. They just change iconography. This is just, an overview. We're not a gallery, we're working on subjects, but the artist Matern, who made this work available, is someone who just explains to us what happens when the normal sujets of painting, like a nude in the workshop or a pot of flowers, is being replaced by what really determines our reality, that is circuit boards and gear shifts and technological constructions as they can be seen in the development of an artificial knee, or how the simple mechanics of a clockwork determine our reality. Although this doesn't really have anything to do with our reality, you can see the systematic development of what is characteristic of iconographies that can be seen as paintings, but that actually represent the basics of today's work. From the early morning when we switch on the light until the very evening when we set the alarm clock, including the brake pedal of our car and the organization of the rear indicators, and even the ways that we make our appointments. This is a recommendation. We can't do more than that, but there is something to this. What would happen if we were to change the iconography of the statement of problems and problem developments entirely, following the example of fine artists, by changing radically the readability of what's problematic about problems, and get to a new perspective entirely? This is what we've been working on internally. How can this be made fruitful for the sciences? The timbres of the paintings, the valeurs of the colors, follow the systematics of the cabinet of the Hamburg Kunsthalle, where you can find the classics of modernity, Picasso, Braque, up until the 1920s. Everything that you can see in terms of colors, valeurs, timbres, moods is actually deduced from traditional painting, but the sujet, the iconography, is based on the factual importance of technology and the technological moment, where there is the formulation of the claim of being able to manage a problem. Being able to manage the problem means the adequate way of dealing with it. In the fine arts, the design concept was devised, coming from evolution, meaning the fitting. To fit into means to be able to adequately deal with the unreachable condition of the possibilities. Hermeneutics in arts has been replaced for 100 years completely by the possibility of communicating. Communication is the form developed by evolution for the individual species to deal with the unreachable conditions of the possibilities in the sense of Kant. That means we can't wait till we understand the conditions for the possibility of survival of species in a habitat, but we always have to know without understanding the conditions for the possibility. And this is characteristic for the concept of communication. And in design, the communicative quality, that is working without understanding, is being formulated as a subject. if we look at the statistics, 99% of everyday work by everyone in the Western world is done by communicating without understanding. That's the new challenge, because those who communicate and work do no longer know through the insight of the conditions of their possibility to function, to work like that, what they should think of what they're doing. And they can't judge it any longer because they don't understand it. And those who are the specialists of understanding are, because of that, in a general sense, dilettantes. Goethe called this to be forced to be a universal dilettante, because the division of labor in society forces us to deal with our field of expertise for 16 hours a day, and that is why in 99% of the other cases we have to be universal dilettantes. That is, those who are able for democracy in understanding what they do not have, do not know, and can't do. If you accept that, and the scientists should be open-minded with a view to experiments, then the path towards the educating sciences, the follow-up organization of AAA accepted this in 1991, the American Association for the Advancement of Arts and Sciences, to actually move from the fine arts to educating sciences, and based on the experiences from 1400 onwards, this needs to be taken into account by sciences. Thank you so much for your attention. It's a bit later than we planned.